Thanks so much, Sarah. And as Mary Sladek gave a little bit of a highlight or preview of during the NASA session or NASA update during the federal agency updates earlier today, we are so excited to have a presentation for you on open science and data and information at the NASA perspective. Presenting for us today is Kevin Murphy in the Science Mission Directorate's who is the Science Mission Directorate's Chief Science Data Officer and responsible for NASA Earth Science Data System and Open Science, as well as Steve Crawford, who is the lead of the Open Source Science Initiative, which includes open science policies for the Science Mission Directorate. So Steve and Kevin, take us away.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for introducing us, and thank you everybody that's dialed in and watching us on another Zoom meeting. Like you said, I'm Kevin Murphy. I'm the Chief Science Data Officer for the Science Mission Directorate, but I also do a lot with open science and earth science. You know, a lot of things that we do within the government take a lot of people, and we've tried to represent many of the people on this title slide. So just to give a shout out and a thanks to everybody who's really contributed to our open science strategy development. I think one of the things that you'll see throughout this presentation is that, science isn't an individual effort, right? Science is done through teams. Science is done through multiple groups, and really is built on the shoulders of others' work. So we really try to make sure that all the people that contribute to at least this development of our strategies are at least highlighted in some way, shape, or form. Next slide, please. So today we'll talk a little bit about open science. We'll talk about why NASA calls it open source science. We'll do some very government-y type of things and use a lot of acronyms like SPD 41A and TOPS. And we'll talk a little bit more about what we're doing in 2023 and how you might be able to engage in the future. Next slide, please. So kind of the big announcement over the past couple of weeks is that the White House announced the Year of Open Science back during the American Meteorological Society meeting and the AAS meeting, I guess about 2 weeks almost now ago, maybe 10 days or so. And they have a definition of open science that you can see kind of highlighted there. Click on the, or not click on, take a picture of the QR code and follow the links. But really, the big thing is that this is a multi-agency initiative across federal government to spark change and inspire open science engagement through events and activities that will advance the adoption of open science. People use open science quite a bit, both in academic as well as other realms. And having the definition, which we all work towards, is critically important. And having the backing of the White House to help, make the efforts of all the agencies that you see listed there, plus others available, is really important. So really happy to see that coming out. Next slide, please. Within NASA, the way that we think of open science is that it should be transparent, making the process of science, the results, and everything that went into it visible, accessible, and understandable. That it should be accessible. That means the data, the tools, the software, the documentations, and publications should be accessible to all using FAIR type principles, which are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, to really press forward our desire to be more inclusive, so that we can get science into the hands of people that need it the most, and those that may not have access to the capabilities to conduct the science, especially that we do at NASA, which sometimes can take very, very large data volumes or very compute intensive activities. Finally, what we're trying to do is make our science more reusable, reproducible, and recreatable. So that's another really big thing that we try to focus on with open science. Next slide, please. So why does NASA call our program to do this the Open Source Science Initiative? It's because it's our method to put open science into practice. And what we're doing, and you'll see this as Steve presents in the later part of this slide deck, but we're really making a commitment to make our scientific process open from the start to the finish, especially for many of the satellite missions that we are developing. We develop satellites that look at the Earth. We develop satellites that look at our solar system, the universe, and our sun. I think that having people involved through the mission development process, which can take many years, sometimes well over 10 years, in the case of like the James Webb Space Telescope, can build the community that can use the data once it becomes, once the instrument or mission is launched, and builds a community that understands how to interact with that information for a long period of time. This allows us to broaden the community involvement in the scientific process by making a lot of our meetings open to the groups, to make the software open, to make the data open, increase the accessibility of data, software, and publications, which really means that we have to have more investments in those areas to make them more widely usable. Finally, we'll facilitate through funding and other things, inclusion, transparency, and reproducibility of science. Next slide, please. So open science isn't necessarily new. People have been, and I would also kind of argue that open science is a bit of a spectrum, right? So on one side you have really closed science, and on the other side you have like fully open science. And we've been kind of, working our way towards the openness across the academic communities, across the government communities for decades. And why have we decided to start this activity today? Well, we think, one, that the technology necessary to make open collaboration and open science a reality is there, right? So the ability to have very low friction ways to communicate and collaborate across vast distances and across national borders and so on and so forth has really kind of evaporated in a lot of ways, not necessarily for everyone, which is why we need to keep a focus on supporting those groups as well. But in general, what we've seen through COVID and other things is that we can really do things that we weren't able to do before. At scales not possible a few years ago. As we see data from our missions and from scientific investigations also increasing very quickly, this need for ways to make that open and trustworthy is also super important. We've seen it quite a bit kind of movement towards national and global momentum for open science as well. The European Commission or the European Union had an open science push about a decade ago. We've seen things come out of the UN on this. We've seen things come out of the National Academies of Science in the not too distant past. And we see NSF and others doing something similar. And, we are a federal government agency, and you've seen executive orders and other legislation that says that we need to make our data, our software, and our publications open. So, I think the timing is critical. The timing is opportune for us to continue down this road in making these investments. Next slide, please. So Steve, at this point, I'm going to hand it over to you, and I'll be here for questions afterwards.
Thanks, Kevin. And yeah, we want to actually talk and share with you some more of the details of the Open Source Science Initiative. And so the initiative was motivated by a community-driven study and strategy that was developed for our data and computing. This really provided an ambitious open science vision through the continuous evolution of SMD science data and computing systems. And it was to develop and implement capabilities to enable open science, continuous evolution of data and computing systems, and harness the community and strategic partnerships for innovation. This led to the establishing of the Chief Science Data Office, along with the Open Source Science Initiative, which is part of that office. The Open Source Science Initiative is a $20 million per year effort to help open up the process of science being done by the NASA Science Mission Directorate. And this has four main areas where we're looking to actually further support open science. One is through the development of policy. And this is actually one of the things that we'll be talking about of the Scientific Information Policy, or SBD 41A, to actually outline how the information that we're producing should be shared. The other is infrastructure, developing technology to further enhance and make it easier to be open with the scientific results and the scientific process. How do we actually make it a normal part of the processes? We've also provided funding to the community to help support open science, especially open source software packages, along with other activities related to support open science. And then community. One of our big efforts will be in training and helping to train the community in open science. And I'll talk about each of these a little bit more. But one of the things I want to first touch on is SBD 41A, which is SMD's updated scientific information policy. This updates the previously released SBD 41, which consolidated existing federal and NASA policy on sharing of scientific information. The policy updates were developed with the science mission, with the SMD community, and that was input via workshops and from requests for information. This also included input from our data repositories and our missions, National Academy studies, and the recently released White House OSTP memo on ensuring free, immediate, and equitable access to federally funded research. And this is you can follow the QR code there to get access to the Scientific Information Policy website, which has links to the policy, along with additional resources to help support the information policy. SBD 41A is built on our open source science principles of accessibility, reproducibility, and inclusion. It aims to make SMD science as open as possible, as restricted as required, and always secure. And SBD 41A looks to maximize openness while minimizing the burden on researchers. We really don't want to introduce unfunded mandates. And so just to go into a little bit more detail of some of the things that we're introducing as part of SBD 41A, the updated policy requirements will apply to future SMD-funded scientific activities. That will be new grants starting with ROSES 2023, which will be released in February of 2023, so about a little less than a month from now, and new missions that have not yet reached key decision point B by March of 2023. Existing grants and missions are not required to adopt the new guidance, but they are encouraged to do so if feasible within available resources. So the policy is really forward-looking, looking at how we actually update things in our future grants and missions. And so just to highlight some of the policy additions and changes which are new in SBD 41A, we do expect all of our publications to be made publicly accessible. And this is that especially for our peer-reviewed manuscripts, shall be deposited in a NASA-designated repository and made freely available with no embargo after the publication date. That our publications describing our missions shall be made publicly accessible, also at the time of their publication. But we also want to make sure that the costs of doing this are covered. And so that reasonable costs for open access publications are allowed, budgetary expenses, and SMD also encourages posting manuscripts as preprints. Posting to the NASA designated repositories as part of the PubSpace repository also has no costs associated with it for our researchers. Our scientific data, we do want the scientific data underlying peer-reviewed manuscripts made publicly available no later than the publication of the peer-reviewed article. And this is the scientifically useful data associated with the research award shall also be made available no later than at the end of the award. That the scientific data should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable following the FAIR principles, and be made available with a clear, open, and accessible data license, and also be citable with a persistent identifier such as a digital object identifier or DOI. The mission data shall be openly available with no period of exclusive access, though we do allow for a period for data calibration and validation. And this period should be as short as possible and shall not exceed 6 months. And all SMD funded scientific activities shall include a data management plan. And our research software, we also know and recognize that software has become an incredibly important part and aspect of the scientific work being done by the NASA Science Mission Directorate community. And as such, to actually fully enable the reproducibility of the scientific papers being published, it is also important that the software becomes publicly available as well. And so that research software shall be shared no later than the time. Research software that is developed under the SMD grants shall be shared no later than the time of publication or at the end of the funding award. To also make it as reusable as possible, it should be assigned a permissive software license. And we also want to make sure that those who are developing software receive credit for their efforts and that those are recognized as well. And so the software should be also released with a citable persistent identifier. And we want to also make sure that our mission software are developed openly in a publicly accessible version control platform that allows for contributions and engagement for the community. This was done, for example, with the James Webb Space Telescope, and we've seen the effects this can have on actually making that information both more accessible and accelerating scientific discovery. And all of our, to help also provide for the planning and also the funding for the activities to make the software accessible, all SMD funded scientific activities shall include a software management plan. We also have some additional updates that are related to investigators and other aspects related in SBD 41A, but that our SMD funded investigators shall have a persistent identifier. ORCID is an example of one of these persistent identifiers and is already widely used in our communities. Publications produced for SMD funded scientific events and presentations shall be made publicly accessible, making sure that all of our information is made publicly available, or as much as possible. That during our proposal reviews, that peer-reviewed data and software shall be recognized as having the commensurate value as peer-reviewed manuscripts. There's more than just manuscripts produced in terms of scientific products, and that those should be also recognized. And that we're going to be providing a persistent identifier for all of our funding mechanisms and missions so that they can be cited to help both the tracking of results, but also to credit those who are creating the ideas that are being produced in our community. And that we should also foster and encourage contributions and engagement with communities and organizations setting standards and best practices along with the open source software communities. And so to provide further resources for the implementation of this, we're implementing several different things. And so one aspect is we have produced an open source science guidelines for SMD funded researchers. This provides much more narrative document beyond just the policy requirements to actually explain how researchers should share their information. We also have frequently asked questions on the scientific information policy. But then 3 other programs that are really going to be going to and helping our overall activities are the Transform to Open Science, which is involved with outreach and training, the development of our core services and our infrastructure, which will actually support and extend, making our scientific information more accessible and also easier to share it, and then funding opportunities to support the adoption of open source science practices. As mentioned, we've released this open source science guidance, which provides narratives on how to comply with SBD 41A, broad guidance relevant for all of the SMD divisions. This is a living document that will be developed over time. In addition, each division will also be releasing their own document, which will have additional guidance, which is specific to their communities. And that's our earth science, heliophysics, astrophysics, biological physical sciences, and planetary science groups. As mentioned, we also have a frequently asked questions, and we're continually adding to those frequently asked questions to address things which are being raised by the community. We're also in the process of developing templates for our open source and data management plans, which include both data management and software management as part of those plans. And these we hope to release with the release of ROSES 23. All of these resources are linked to our scientific information policies, and so you can find more details there. In addition, we're developing core services. Right now, we have released the Science Discovery Engine, which actually provides search across all of the NASA SMD's data sets and allows you to actually search for different data sets along with other documents and research products that are actually being produced. We're further expanding the astrophysics data system, which provides search into publications beyond just astrophysics, but in addition to the other SMD divisions, to provide the actual same services that the astronomy community has been benefiting from for 30 years to the planetary, earth science, and heliophysics communities, so that they can actually also have that same search capabilities within their publications and linking to their data and other products. And then we're also currently conducting a study on data and computing infrastructure necessary to support open science. There currently is an RFI, which is open related to the data and computing architecture study, where we're actually looking for further feedback on what open science infrastructure the community needs to further and better enhance how they can actually openly share their information and conduct their science in an open way. We also have a range of different funding opportunities for our community, ranging from support for topical workshops, symposium, and conferences, which would support open science events, such as hackathons on conferences or challenges that build up open science skills and training. We've been supporting the open source science tools, frameworks, and libraries, which is aimed at many of the open source software and also open science tools that underline much of our community and have long supported our community, such as projects like NumPy, AstroPy, and arXiv. We have a supplement for open source software awards, which helps existing NASA grant holders convert and modernize their software and release it as open source software. We also have a further enhancement of our Transform to Open Science training program, looking to actually provide training and also additional modules related to open science. This has just closed. But our other currently open solicitation is a high priority open source science. This is supporting innovative open source tools, frameworks, libraries, data formats, and libraries. It's a rolling deadline, typically looking to support one-year projects that are highly innovative and supportive of open source science. And we'll also be in the future advertising solicitation in ROSES 23, which will supplement the use of scientific software platforms, such as, and to enable further cloud usage of our data. And so the other large program, which is part of the Open Source Science Initiative, is a NASA Transform to Open Science, or TOPS. This is a $40 million 5-year mission to accelerate the adoption of open science, and it has the following strategic goals of supporting 20,000 researchers to earn NASA Open Science badges, double the participation of historically excluded groups across NASA science, and enable 5 major scientific discoveries through open science principles. There are 4 main pillars of activities in this in terms of engagement on open science, capacity sharing, incentives for open science, and coordination of open science. And this is one of the activities that we're kicking off in the Year of Open Science 2023. And to highlight some of the activities which are involved in it, as mentioned, we want people to have actually an opportunity to train in open science and develop the skills related to open science. And so we are actually going to have a NASA Open Science certification. It is designed to provide researchers with core open science skills. For example, creating the digital tools to perform, creating and using the digital tools to perform open science, for example, GitHub and ORCID, becoming aware of data management and software management plan best practices and resources, growing connections across a community of open science practitioners, and with the aim of developing a community with the aim of developing community-developed material to introduce the open science along with the principles of increasing inclusivity, accessibility, and diversity at the forefront of these material. There is actually a sign-up form if you're actually interested in learning more or signing up to be to take one of the courses, and you can follow the QR code to access that form. But what will you learn in Open Core, which is our open science certificate program? This currently has 5 modules, which is an ethos of open science. What is open science? Why should I do it? A open tools and resources, how to use popular open science tools. Open software, how to use, make, and share software for science. Open data, how to use, make, and share open data. And then open results, best practices for sharing all results and analysis, as well as peer review, and how practices like data management plans and software management plans can further help and enhance how you are actually sharing the results and processes that you're undertaking. If you complete all 5 areas, and we'll have options for passing out of areas for those who are already practicing open science, they can actually earn the full TOPS Open Science badge and NASA certification. And so this brings us, and as Kevin had started with the year of open science, and for NASA, we're very excited to be participating in the 2023 year of open science, and to change everyone, we need everyone. And some of the things that, and year of open science goals for everyone is to help groups actually develop a strategic plan for open science, improve the transparency, integrity, and equity of reviews, account for open science activities and evaluations, and engage with underrepresented communities in the advancement of open science. And we're really excited to be kicking off the year of open science. We'll be releasing our full curriculum a little bit later this year. And we're also really happy and excited to be having and supporting some of our open science principles with our latest grants and missions. And so I think that's the end of our slide deck and what we were hoping to share with you. And so I think we can stop here to then take questions and hopefully continue the conversation about NASA's open source science initiative.
Thanks so much, Kevin and Steve, for that wonderful presentation. A lot of great pictures, and Steve said he's got even better ones, so I'd love to see the better ones too. I was hoping that I could ask for one clarification, and then we do have some questions in the Q&A as well. But in some of the slides, there were references to scientific data and mission data. And earlier today, we were talking about the NIH policy, and the definition of scientific data is of utmost importance and hotly debated. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about scientific data and mission data, and maybe how you define those and how they're different.
Yeah, we have, so NASA is in a, we have the very significant missions that usually, things like the Hubble Space Telescope, the James Webb Space Telescope, the Perseverance rover on Mars. These are really big projects led by the Science Mission Directorate. And we do have a range of them. We do have I'll even share my screen again, so you can actually see one of the nice pictures. But we do have, which is actually our fleet of scientific and operating missions. And so there's a very, very large number of these mission projects which are producing scientific data. And some of these are built to answer a specific scientific question, and some of these are built to answer general scientific questions and can be used by the wider community for a range of different things. But for these missions, because these are really public assets, we do actually hold a higher expectation for the release of this data. We really want this data to be made publicly accessible as quickly as possible. And so for our mission data, we have a policy of no exclusive access. We do want it to be released as high quality data, so we do have an expectation or that there may be a period for calibration and validation, but that period is as short as possible and not longer than 6 months. But we also provide the resources to make sure that that data is made available and that high quality data is released to the public, so they have access to that scientific data. And it is really great and amazing to actually see what happens with the JWST data or even the Mars data or a lot of our other projects about how quickly the wide community, both research scientists and the public community, start using that data to do some really amazing things. But we also fund research grants. And so these are typically funded by our ROSA solicitation. And then this is work which is done by groups of scientists or small teams of scientists to answer specific scientific questions. And it is important for scientists to have that time while they're working through their data, while they're working through their project, and that chance to publish their results. And so that's why for our research data, which is primarily funded through our ROSA's grants, we only expect that to become publicly available at the time of publication. We do actually say that that the data that is made available is our data needed to validate and reproduce the results in the publication, and that the scientific useful data is made publicly available. We do leave scientific useful as something that's a little bit broad, because different communities may have different definitions. But that is at the top level policy, but that is something where each of the divisions will be giving more guidance on what that means and what type of data would be expected to be made publicly available with the publication or at the end of the grant.
Thank you so much for that clarification. And then there's one very specific question in the Q&A, but I think there's a broader question in there too, that how does NASA kind of remedy the contradiction between open science and underlying concerns driving something like the China restriction? Or in the presentation, you mentioned as open as possible, as restricted as required. And space research, there's a lot of instruments there or data that might be export controlled or something like that. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how NASA approaches that particular issue, or what guidance you would give to a researcher in trying to navigate that tricky line, as open as possible, as restricted as required, how to make sure you're falling right on that line.
I guess Kevin will let me take the first pass at this. And I also see Mary Sladek has raised their hand, who would also be a good person to potentially provide a response, as she's part of the NASA Science Mission Directorate and the office there. We do expect and hope that and this is, well, I should actually not even say hope. We do expect our scientists and our researchers and those who are receiving our grants and our missions to be compliant with the additional policies. This is why we say as open as possible, as restricted as necessary, and always secure. And that we do have different groups in terms of ITAR and export control and other considerations. And so this is something which is important to describe as part of your data management plan for an individual researcher, or as part of a larger group to work closely with NASA to make sure that the information which must be restricted is identified and appropriately handled. And that also includes things like personal identification information, other things that would actually limit that. And so those aspects are important to address. On the other hand, NASA does have regulations limiting the bilateral participation with China. That's commonly referred to as the Wolf Amendment. but that doesn't prevent the open release of our data. And so that is, as long as it's, and if anything, it's actually the opposite of, if you were only sharing your data with China, then that would be problematic. But there isn't any limitations on, once the data is allowed to be openly released, for that to be widely openly released and made accessible. I don't know if Kevin wants to add some further comments on that.
Sarah also worked her magic, and Mary Slottick is able to unmute and speak as well if you wanted to kind of call in reinforcements.
Yeah, so I just say kind of exactly what Steve said, right? Like, NASA has processes by which we evaluate the information that's generated from our missions and released publicly, right? So when we want to release a piece of software, you know, it's got to go through a software release process. And that software release process evaluates things like, you know, ITAR, EAR, restrictions, so on and so forth. Typically, however, you know, the data that we generate from our scientific missions has no kind of embargo or restrictions on release. In fact, you know, I think that's one of the biggest things that the U.S. government does, is to provide scientific information to allow the creativity of our researchers in the United States, but also their collaborators around the world to work together, right? So, you know, we do take security and legal aspects very seriously. But, you know, when we're looking at earth science information on weather, or if we're looking at, you know, anything related to things that are not on Earth, you know, those are typically resources that can be completely openly shared.
Mary, is there anything you would want to add to that?
Yeah, I thought I would just add that Christian Diallo mentioned that the NASA Grant and Cooperative Agreement Manual recently tried to clarify the language about China and the restrictions on NASA and people receiving NASA funding. And so in general, NASA's policy on performing research with foreign organizations is always on a no exchange of funds fund basis. And it is set forth in the NASA FAR supplement. In addition, proposals that include the participation of China or Chinese-owned companies are ineligible to receive an award. There is actually an assurance in the that awardees have to agree to that says that the proposal represents the proposer is not China or a Chinese-owned company, and the proposer will not participate, collaborate, or coordinate bilaterally with China or any Chinese-owned company at the prime level or at any subrecipient level, whether the bilateral involvement is funded or performed under a no exchange of funds basis. I just would like to emphasize that the implementation of these restrictions, once you are awarded, really resides with your sponsored research office. So please, if you are having concerns, the first stop is actually not us. It's your sponsored research office, the export control, and the research compliance team. And I sorry to be the bureaucrat here, but I think that Kevin and Steve did a great job answering from the data perspective. The concerns with China really, it's a all follow the money episode. Like if it's NASA money, but once the money's out and you know the data are available, right? That's different. It's the actual implementation of the research.
Thanks for the backup there, Mary.
Yeah, thank you, Mary. So a somewhat related question, will NASA be placing specific language in awards identifying what specific data or software generated under the award is going to be restricted? And I might ask that question a little bit differently too, or expand on it to ask, there was some reference to generating templates potentially for what a data management or an open source plan would look like. And so would maybe those templates also prompt thinking about or provide guidance on what products may need to be restricted in some way? And we're talking a lot about NIH, so, you know, PHI and things like that, you know, they ask you to consider that. So would NASA do something similar?
Yeah, and in SBD 41A, we do give some examples of the type of restrictions that might be things to consider. As said, for our research solicitations, this is something, you know, referencing that, but then describing as part of your science management plan, your software management plan, as in, you know, this is different reasons why this software might be restricted, which could include intellectual property, could include, as you said, the personal information, could include export control, or could also be security concerns. And so we do give some general descriptions of those. For our missions, we go into a little bit more detail just because there is some further standards and other aspects related to that. But we'll probably not go into too much further detail, just because there is actually a wide range of different reasons and cases where you may want to restrict something. But that is, you know, including that as examples of something to include in the templates and what could be described as part of the software management plan would be something that we'd hope to kind of include as part of, as part of the template, not just like you need this section, but what should go in that what should go in that section as well.
Awesome, thank you. And we have one more question regarding drone research and whether you think data resulting from drone research would be included in the open source programs.
Well, I was going to say, at least for SMD, probably our most famous drone is the Ingenuity helicopter on Mars currently. And one of the great things is the framework they actually built their software on, they released as open source software. And so that's a fantastic example of a project that's being open. And in addition, the data which comes off of it is made immediately available. And so that's another great example of the open science being done by projects like that. I think as we look forward and how we involved other projects and involvement of drones in SMD science will have to be actually something that we look forward to and further design as open science as they develop.
Mary, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sorry. NASA is also under, sorry to be again the administrative policy person, unmanned or uncrewed aerial systems, drones, are actually subject to a particular regulation that's administered by the Aircraft Management Division. So I think this is actually a kind of complicated question that there may be things that could impact. I don't know if Steve and Kevin have been talking to the Aircraft Management Division, Norm Schweitzer. You might want to check with him about the laws and regulations that they are subject to, and hence also grantees and contractors funded by NASA.
Thanks, Mary.
And from one bureaucratic research administrator to another, Mary, never need to apologize for being a bureaucratic administrator, but thank you.
Yeah, it's always helpful to mention that additional information. As mentioned, yeah, the research on drones is usually carried out by other divisions than SMD, and so it's useful to mention that as well, which do follow different policies than the ones discussed here.
Thank you both. I have sort of one more question for my kind of own interest, or maybe for interest in terms of how FDP or member organizations consider how we're going to move forward with our own sort of post-award management of these types of requirements. And in some discussions with DMP Tool, so I hope that you are thinking about or will consider collaborating with DMP Tool when you all are ready to work on your templates as well. It's a tool that a lot of institutions really value. And they're working, I believe, on creating the ability to assign a persistent identifier to the data management plan. And I noticed that you mentioned that NASA is considering adding a persistent identifier to the funding mechanism. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on, is it most appropriate for both to have a persistent identifier and link them, or because a data management plan could span across multiple funding sources, would a data management plan be a better avenue to pursue, or what your thoughts on that would be?
I mean, I think that's a really good question. And something, so right now, we do know about the DMP tool. There is actually some of the existing DMP templates that we have, which are available there. And we do hope to post our updated and new templates available there as well, because it does look like a great resource. We currently don't require the DMPs for our research projects to be publicly available. And so I think that's something to consider and look at in the future. And one of the things that we do want to look at in the future is how we actually, monitor how things are being made available, and how this is also being, or the potential ability to update a data management plan, or other aspects. And so, this would be a great area of I think, of further conversations with FDP, because I think this is, one of the areas that we know we need to look at further, and it's also great to see what some of the other groups are doing.
Well, we love demonstrations here at the Federal Demonstration Partnership. So any ideas you have for a demonstration, much appreciated. So I don't see any other questions in our Q&A. And so Steve and Kevin, I don't know if there's any closing comments you wanted to offer.
I'll just add, I'll add the link to our request for information. This is related to our data and compute study, and how we can actually use both a wide variety of data and computing to enable open science. And so I imagine that is probably and that's currently open, and open until I think mid to late February. And so we certainly would, February 21st, it closes. And we certainly would love to hear from many people in this community about what you need and to be enabled to further advance open science. And it would also be fantastic to further discuss with this community about, as you said, things that could be demonstrated or further discussed. And so looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Great. Thanks so much, Stephen. And thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today for our final session of the day, I believe, though hopefully Sarah will jump in and correct me if I'm wrong on that. And we look forward to seeing everyone again tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. Eastern for our next session, Safeguarding the U.S. Research Enterprise, Transparency, Integrity, and Reciprocity. So much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.